2 days, my father whispered, tugging me away from the rehearsal dinner bustle. The fairy horns on Elliott Bay carried across the lawn, and the string lights blinked like they were trying to warn us. He didn't meet my eyes. You can't marry Nick. I laughed once, the nervous, hostessy kind. Dad, we've covered the song order 3 times. We're fine. He shook his head. No. You can't marry him because he's your brother. The words dropped between the clink of glasses. When I was young, I was with his mother. No one knows. The wind-off Puget Sound lifted the hem of my dress. Somewhere behind us, someone tested the microphone and said, "Check, check." And it sounded like a verdict. I'm Olivia Davenport, 31, program coordinator at the Bainbridge Island Community Center, grant proposals by day, teen robotics, and senior yoga by night. I have known Nick Hall since we were kids tossing pine cones over the fence between our small houses. Our moms shared sugar, ladders, and gossip. Our dads shared polite nods. Mine shared very little else. Nick took me to junior prom in a borrowed suit and proposed to me 5 years ago on a rainy hike at Discovery Park, my hair a nest and my answer instant. We grew up side by side, the good kind of obvious. My father, Robert, did not grow alongside much. He was the parent who came to concerts late and left early. He put in years as a contractor around Kitsap County, good with beams, bad with birthdays. He and my mother, Marisol, divorced when I was in college, an ending that felt like the formal paperwork on something long finished. He was a sometimes guest in my life, occasional breakfasts, practical gifts, a habit of clearing his throat before bad news. That night, he cleared it 3 times. Dad, I said, keeping my voice even because I am good at saving the mood in rooms. That isn't funny. He flinched. I'm not joking, Liv. Then you're cruel. I meant it calmly. He looked past my shoulder toward the water, where the lights of Seattle winked like a city pretending not to listen. Before you were born, he said, Elaine and I, he swallowed the rest. Your mother never knew. No one did. But if he's mine. You're telling me this now? My voice stayed soft, the way voices do when thunder has already rolled. After 5 years of dating? After invitations, deposits, head counts? After I've chosen a first dance song and promised 2 families a future? I thought it didn't matter, he said, and the sentence made my hands go cold. I didn't think. I never expected you 2 would. You were kids together, neighbors. It felt impossible. Then it wasn't. Do you know? I asked. Or are you guessing at math? Silence, except for the sound of forks set carefully back on plates. In my periphery, Nick tugged at a balloon ribbon for my niece, his smile easy as a dock chair. Elaine, his mother, was boiling corn in the lodge kitchen, sleeves rolled. My mother had a clipboard and that calm that can only be practiced. I don't know, Dad said finally. I never asked. I'm asking you not to go through with it until... Until what? I whispered. You run a paternity test on my heart? He winced. I deserve that. You deserve worse, I said, and the smallness of my tone surprised me. I could feel the 2 halves of my life trying not to split, the rehearsal dinner laughter, and the word brother ringing like a fire alarm. You will tell Mom, I said. You will tell Elaine. You will tell Nick. I was hoping. He stopped because hope had no business here. You were hoping I would carry your secret down the aisle like flowers, I said. No. He straightened, a carpenter's posture against a storm. Liv, I didn't raise you to be cruel. You didn't raise me, I said, and it landed without heat. He closed his eyes, opened them, and took a step back, as if distance could make the sentence less true. I am trying to do the right thing. Then do it earlier next time, I said. Not 2 days before I put on a dress. Behind us, Claire, the friend who knows my tells like a second language, watched from the edge of the tent, her brows knit into a prayer. Nick caught my eye, lifted his glass in a little salute that said, We're almost there. My stomach tilted. Please, Dad said, voice down to its last board. Postpone. Quietly. Let me figure it out. There are moments when you can feel a life choose its fork. I thought about the girls at the center who come to my office to practice hard conversations, the seniors who line up for flu shots because truth makes you safer even when it stings, the grant reports where outcomes must match promises. I thought about 5 years of movie nights and bike repairs and ferry rides with Nick, 100 small proofs of kindness. I thought about the way my mother had stood in every empty space my father left and refused to complain. "You've built a lie and called it protection," I said. "The only thing I know to do with lies is turn on the porch light. Live. You have tonight," I said, "to decide whether you tell them yourself or I do." He stared at me like a man who suddenly notices the span he thought was solid has dry rot. "If I tell them, will you wait?" "I won't marry a question mark," I said. "But I won't marry a secret either. Pick which one you want to live with." The MC tapped the mic, and the tent did that happy hush people practice for good news. "Quick toast," he called. Claire slipped to my side, her hand finding mine. "You okay?" she breathed. "No," I said. "But I'm going to be honest." We walked back under the lights. The rehearsal rolled on, lines spoken, laughs placed, plates cleared. My father sat at the far end of a table and drank water like it might rinse him clean. My mother, cheeks pink from the kitchen heat, beamed at us and didn't yet know she was aiming her light at a storm. When the toasts ended, Nick found me at the edge of the lawn. "Tomorrow's the easy day," he said, bumping my shoulder. "You ready?" My mouth remembered how to smile. "Always." He kissed my forehead, simple and sure. Elaine called from the porch to send Tupperware home with me the way she had since middle school. The ferry's lights slid across the dark water like a patient thought. I tucked Dad's confession into the place where triage lives and drove home with Claire, both of us quiet, both of us listening to the way tires hum when they're holding something heavy. In my childhood bedroom, I pressed my palms flat on my desk and drew a list with 2 columns, truth told by me and truth told by him. Only one column had boxes I could check tonight. I circled it, because if a secret could threaten to erase 5 years of a life I'd built with care, then my voice could be the thing that kept the outline from being smudged away. I set an alarm, texted Claire tomorrow, we gather everyone, and lay down fully dressed. Out the window, the sound breathed in and out like it could carry the weight. I practiced the sentence until it fit in my mouth. "Mom, Elaine, there's something you need to hear. 2 days to a wedding is a bad time for an origin story. It's the only time I had." Morning cracked open like a plate. I woke before the fairy horns and lay staring at the hairline in the ceiling plaster, thinking about all the other hairlines I hadn't seen. The rehearsal dinner glow was gone. What remained was a single assignment with a hard deadline: tell the truth before the truth broke us. I texted Claire. 9 a.m., my mom's. Need you there. She sent back a heart and a coffee emoji, which was friendship in 2 pixels. Then I texted 3 people I owed everything to and feared losing: Mom, Marisol, Elaine, Nick's mom, and Dad. My message was brisk on purpose. "We need to talk today. At Mom's. 9 sharp. Non-negotiable." I added Nick, then deleted his name, then added it again. He answered first. "I'll be there. Are you okay?" I typed "I will be," which had become my only possible truth. Bainbridge mornings are the kind that pretend nothing bad ever happens. Light pouring through cedars, dew bright on the grass, gulls making the same arguments as yesterday. Mom had the kettle on, and the living room staged like she was expecting a donor visit. Couch cleared, coasters placed, a plate of lemon bars sweating under plastic wrap. She read my face and didn't ask questions. "I'll let them in," she said, and kissed my cheek so quickly it felt like a secret we kept together. Dad came first. He stood on the porch with his contractor shoulders squared like he might be inspected. "Liv," he said, eyes flicking over my shoulder for an escape route. I didn't step aside. He took off his baseball cap like a man entering a sanctuary and set it brim up on the hall table. Elaine arrived a minute later carrying a dish towel for no reason except mothers carry things. She smelled like soap and rosemary. Nick followed, crease between his brows, confusion drawn clean on his face. He reached for my hand. I tucked them both into my pockets. Mom closed the door and turned the deadbolt, not as a threat, as a mercy. Let's finish this without an audience. I asked you here. I began, standing instead of sitting because some truths require altitude, because there's a sentence that can't live in my head anymore. Their eyes found me like birds finding a wire. Last night Dad told me he was with Elaine before I was born. That Nick might be his son. I didn't look at my fiancé when I said his son. I looked at my father because that is where the sentence belongs. Elaine's dish towel slipped to the floor as if it understood before we did. Robert, she said, my father's name suddenly too large for the room. He pressed his lips together and stared at his thumbs. Mom didn't blink. She exhaled once, long, as if a draft had finally been found. Tell them, I said to Dad. He cleared his throat the way he always did before shifting a beam. We were young, he said. Before Marisol and I married. I was stupid, and then I was a coward. I never asked questions I didn't want answers to. You ask none? Mom said, voice surgical. For 3 decades? I told myself it didn't matter, he said, and the words landed like nails scattering on hardwood. Nick had been a statue. Now he took one step forward. You're telling me, he said slowly, like he was tasting every syllable to be sure it was poison, that the woman I'm marrying and he didn't finish. He didn't have to. The word brother ghosted the room, without oxygen. I don't know, Dad said, and pressed his hands together. I never asked. I should have. I didn't. I'm sorry. He looked at Elaine, then at Mom, then at me. I'm sorry. Elaine sat. Not collapsed, sat, deliberately, the way you sit when a storm arrives at a table you set yourself. You and I, she said to my father, were reckless. That's a sin I can hold in my 2 hands. But this, she glanced at Nick and me, the space between us suddenly a border. This is something else. Mom didn't sit. She had that nurse's stillness that means the bleeding hasn't started yet but will. You let me build a life out of a house you knew had rot, she said. You watched our kids share lunches and birthdays and bus stops. You watched them fall in love. She didn't raise her voice. She made a list. Nick rubbed his jaw, looking back and forth between us like he was solving a puzzle with pieces from 2 boxes. How do we know? He asked, almost pleading. We could. There are tests. Right? This is science, not gossip. He looked at me. Liv. I won't marry a question, I said softly. But I won't marry a secret either. We take the test today. The words tasted like metal and mercy. Dad closed his eyes. Okay, he said, and his shoulders dropped like a belt had been loosened. I'll do whatever it takes. No, Mom answered. You'll do what you should have done 30 years ago. And you'll do it without asking any of us to hold your hand. Elaine reached for Nick's arm and missed by an inch. I should have told you who I was then, she said to my father. Shame taught me to fold the truth up small. She looked at me. I'm sorry, Olivia. I nodded. It was an apology shaped like a life, not a sentence. We'll need you both, I said, to give samples. The words felt like a police drama. The reality felt like a benediction. Let the facts be kind or let them be cruel, but let them be known. We made appointments so fast the receptionist's voice crackled. Claire drove us to the clinic in her dented Outback, wedging tissues in the cup holders, because friendship is logistics with a soul. On the way, the island looked the same, and nothing looked the same. The coffee stand still wrote names in foam. The high school's reader board still promised Go Spartans and drama club auditions Friday. I watched a kid skateboard along the shoulder and wondered if next to his list of fears, grades, acne, the end of the world, he had accidentally in love with maybe brother. At the clinic, fluorescent lights knew no shame. Forms knew no poetry. The nurse who swabbed my cheek said, "Big family," in that small talk tone, and I almost said, smaller with every sentence, but I smiled and said, "We're working on being honest." Nick's hand brushed mine as we sat in the waiting area, 2 clipboard people in a row of coughs and magazines. He whispered, "No matter what the paper says, I know what my life says," and I had to swallow hard to keep the room from tilting. Dad's turn took the longest. He came out with red ears like he'd been scolded, which I hope he had by a nurse who had seen worse, and decided to express mercy by not pretending. Mom didn't go in because she didn't need to. Elaine walked out with her jaw set like a promise to past and future both. Results would take 2 days. The same 2 days we had left to the wedding. The countdown took on a new meaning, 48 hours to see if my name for love had to be replaced with a synonym for grief. We drove back to Mom's. She set down the lemon bars we hadn't touched and said, "I'm not putting out coffee. This house is closed to hospitality until people decide to be decent." Dad stood on the porch trying to figure out where to put his hands. "Marisol," he said, her name careful as a glass, "I never wanted to hurt you." "And yet," she said, and her smile was so tired you could have slept in it. Elaine turned to me. "If it turns out," she stopped, corrected. "Whatever it turns out, you tell me what to do, and I will do it. If it means a different seating chart, a different life, we'll do that too." "I want the same thing I wanted yesterday," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my bones. "To marry the man I have known since we were 6. To dance with both my mothers." I glanced at Mom and Elaine. The word was plural and honest. "To feel the floor under my feet." Nick stepped closer as if he'd been waiting for that permission. "We'll wait," he said. "We'll breathe. We'll eat. We'll keep the chairs rented and the flowers ordered, and in 2 days we'll know whether our aisle is straight or whether we build a new one somewhere else." He looked at my father without blinking. "And you will not speak to Olivia without my say-so until the results come in." "Nick," I said. "No," he replied, calm as the dock. "He made a mess. We'll clean it with rags, not with our hands." Dad nodded like a man agreeing to a sentence he couldn't bargain down. "I'll book a motel," he said to Mom. "I'll give you space." "You'll book a life," she said. Space is a side effect. When everyone had gone, and the house finally exhaled, Claire and I sat on the floor with our backs against the couch. "You did it," she said. "I detonated a secret," I said. "That's not the same as a bomb," she answered. "Secrets already explode. You just decided to control the blast." I laughed, which felt like a small heresy and a small cure. Then I wrote a list on a sticky note and put it on the fridge because structure is how I stay standing. Call venue. Hold. Call baker. Confirm. Call band. No change. Tell bridesmaids. Waiting period, no speculation. Eat something. The last one I circled 3 times. Then I called Elaine and Mom, not as antagonists, as a committee. We divided tasks like field medics. Elaine would call her side of the family and ask for quiet. Mom would call ours and say the same. I would call no one but the florist, because the peonies had already been persuaded to open on a schedule, and I respected anything that bloomed under pressure. That night, Nick and I sat on my porch steps like we used to after middle school, tennis shoes knocking lightly. "Do you want to postpone?" he asked, voice careful. "I want to marry you," I said. "If the paper says I can." "If the paper says we can't." I looked out at the sound where the ferry slid like a thought from one life to another. "Then we will be 2 people who told the truth and didn't die of it," I said. "And then we will decide what the next true thing is." He nodded, eyes wet. "Okay." We didn't kiss. We didn't say forever. We let the night sit with us and do its quiet work. When he left, I set another alarm. 48 hours is an eternity inside a body. It is also a blink. I wrote one more list, the list I would need if the results burned the aisle to ash. Find a therapist, return the dress, take a ferry anyway with Claire, and eat fries on the deck. Tell the teenagers at the community center that sometimes life makes you do a hard assignment and you can still get an A for honesty. Then I wrote the other list, the one I wanted. Keep the chairs, write vows that include the word neighbor because that is how we started, dance with both mothers, learn to forgive my father at a human pace instead of a cinematic one. 2 lists. 1 porch light. Sometimes life is choosing which list to put on the fridge and which to fold into your pocket. I did both, because I have learned you can love one outcome with your whole body and still prepare for the other with your whole brain. I slept. Not well, but honestly. And in the morning, the island looked like any other day that hasn't yet decided whether to ruin you or to give you back to yourself. The first 24 hours were the loud kind of quiet. Everyone around us moved into their assigned roles. My mother fielded curious calls with a nurse's trio, Elaine kept niece Emma occupied with sugar cookies and a library of picture books. Claire made lists I didn't know I needed. Dad's truck disappeared from our street. The neighbors, who always waved longer but from farther away, the way people do when they sense a storm dog needs space. We kept the wedding machinery humming at a whisper. The florist assured me the peonies could hold another day if treated like dignitaries, which meant cool rooms and no drafts. The band leader said, "We've got you, whatever the cue." The venue offered to shift the deposit if needed, and then, unexpectedly, told me about her sister who postponed a wedding for chemo and danced a year later. "Different reasons," she said. "Same stubbornness. We'll be here." Nick and I agreed to see each other only in daylight and only in public places where our hands would behave. We met at the harbor and watched the ferry tug itself across the channel, its wake fanning out like a timeline. "You ever think about how many lives a boat carries back and forth?" he said, because Nick makes philosophical observations like other men make panini. Whole stories cross the water, and no one claps when they dock. "I'll clap for us," I said, quietly, with soup. He smiled, the tired kind. "Deal." By afternoon, the town had a version. It wasn't the right version, but it wasn't the cruelest. People who loved us must have been practicing a choreography of kindness. There's a delay, family stuff, nothing for Facebook. Still, rumors gather like fog. A woman I recognized from the grocery store stopped me to ask if I was canceling because of Mercury in retrograde. I said, "Because of science," and she nodded soberly as if planets were a subcategory of lab work. That evening, Mom and I sat with the guest list between us like a map to a country being redrawn. "If we postpone," she said, "we can keep most people, replace the cake tiers, ask the DJ for a credit." She did the math of disruption, while I did the math of breath. "If we don't postpone," she added, "I can reroute the cocktail hour to the lawn and ask the caterer to add more savory things. People chew less when they're crying." She smiled sideways. I loved her so much it hurt. "Thank you for not telling me what to do," I said. She sipped her tea. "I never like directors. I like stage managers. They make sure the lights work and the band gets fed. The actors do their own living." We didn't talk about Dad. Not out of denial, but because the conversation had migrated from the living room to a courthouse none of us had entered yet. When his text finally pinged, "Result tomorrow. Wherever you want to meet, I'll be there," Mom read it over my shoulder and said, "Make him come to us." The second morning, I walked to the teen program office and stood in the doorway before unlocking it. The whiteboard still had last week's Ask Me Anything prompts from kids who wanted to know how to do taxes and how to stop hating mornings. I erased "Do you think love lasts?" because the dry erase marker felt like a prophecy I didn't have the right to write. Then I added how to have hard talks to the workshop list. If we kept the wedding, I would need my best self ready. If we didn't, I would need her more. At noon, Claire drove me to the clinic in a silence we filled with gum and a mid-2000s playlist that had aged into comfort food. Nick was already in the parking lot, leaning against his car and looking like my entire childhood and my next life at once. Elaine stood beside him, one hand in his elbow and one hand on her phone like she was holding past and future in two different grips. Mom arrived with a folder she didn't need. Nurses love folders. Dad pulled in last, parked badly, and straightened it, metaphorically if not in fact. He looked older than he had on any other day of my life, which felt both fair and beside the point. He nodded at us like we were a jury. Maybe we were. The receptionist recognized us and led us into a conference room with a tissue box and a fake plant in a basket. The lab tech had the kindness of people who daily witness aftermath. She slid the results into the center of the table as if the truth itself were shy. "I'll give you privacy," she said, and left. No one reached for the envelope. I did, because someone had to be the person in the room who does the thing that must be done. I slid my finger under the flap, unfolded the paper, read the words that were simpler than the last 48 hours deserved, and handed it to Mom. She read, then Elaine, then Nick, then Dad. Negative. Not a brother. Not a split-life cosmic trick. A lover. A fiancé. A neighbor, not a sibling. The science that had kept me from sleeping let me breathe. Elaine closed her eyes and let out a sound I had heard only once before, when Emma had been born and cried her first cry, an exhale with a thank you embedded in the vowel. Mom pressed her lips together and squeezed my hand until our knuckles made a new color. Nick leaned back and laughed the laugh of someone who has been waiting on the edge of the pool for a whistle that finally blows. Not a brother. Not a cosmic punchline. Just the man I'd loved since childhood. The neighbor who'd become my future. The words sat on the paper like a door swinging open. Elaine let out a breath that sounded like relief and apology braided together. Mom squeezed my hand so hard our knuckles made a new color. Nick laughed once, disbelieving, then covered his face with both hands as if the ceiling had finally stopped lowering. Dad sagged into his chair. The room smelled like pine cleaner and fresh ink, ordinary things that felt holy. We didn't cheer. We didn't collapse. We passed the paper around until its edges softened, like you do with a truth you plan to keep. The lab tech knocked softly and asked if we needed anything. Nothing, Mom said, and everything, and the woman nodded as if she'd heard that answer before. In the parking lot, Nick and I stood under a strip of sky the color of an unripe pear. You're shaking, he said. I've been holding my breath for 48 hours, I said. Even my bones forgot how to exhale. He touched my cheek. Then exhale. I did. It came out as a half laugh, half sob that belonged in no genre, and everyone. We can keep the aisle, I whispered. We can keep the aisle, he repeated, and it felt like a vow. We drove back to my mother's house in 3 cars that all knew the route. Mom set the paper on the mantel, not like a trophy, but like a fire extinguisher. Elaine wiped her eyes with the dish towel that had fallen yesterday and said to Dad, "You did the worst thing at the worst time. And still, thank you for not letting them marry a question." Dad nodded. He looked smaller, or maybe just honest. "I'm sorry," he said, again and again, until the words stopped pretending to be sufficient and started being simply true. We had 40 hours to rebuild a wedding around a crater. Claire turned our living room into a war room. Timelines taped to the wall, pens in a mug, a plate of lemon bars finally eaten. "Okay," she said, clapping once. "Call the venue. On. Call the baker. On. Call the band. On. Call your spine. Already on." I called the florist. "The peonies," she said, "have been holding their breath, but they believe in you." We laughed like people who'd been rescued by flowers. The venue manager rerouted cocktail hour to the lawn for extra breeze and fewer rumors. The DJ promised to cut any songs that made people cry the wrong kind of tears. Elaine offered to greet guests at the door with a smile that said welcome and also behave. Mom plated sandwiches and declared the house open for hospitality again. Invitations didn't change, but the guest list did. Some people bowed out with polite lies about travel. Others leaned in with casseroles and non-judgment. The town, hungry for the next plotline, began to move on. Truth has a way of tiring even gossip. That night, Dad texted to ask if he should attend. I stared at the screen long enough for the dots to tire. Yes, I wrote, finally. You'll sit with the parents, you'll sign nothing, and you'll say less than you think. You'll also apologize to Mom, publicly, and to Elaine, and to us, in whatever words don't make you the hero. He replied, understood. The morning of the wedding smelled like clean linen and new pages. The lodge looked untouched by yesterday, beams warm with light, the view of Elliott Bay steady as a metronome. My dress slid on like it had been forgiven. Claire pinned my hair, without commentary. Mom kissed my temple and said, "Stage manager's ready." Elaine appeared in the doorway and whispered, "I ironed the napkins out of penance," and we both laughed until mascara threatened the treaty. Before the ceremony, we gathered both families in the small room behind the arbor. Dad stood with his cap in his hands and delivered the apology, without theatrics. He named the harm, claimed the cowardice, did not reach for the word mistake, as if they were triplets. Mom listened with the composure of a woman who has triaged worse and decided to go on living. At the end she said, "You will call the lawyer on Monday," and he said, "Yes." Elaine nodded once, regal in the way only a woman who has done hard things can be. Nick took my hand openly, no longer worried it might be taken away by a piece of paper. We walked the aisle to a hymn the quartet played like a lullaby. The arbor wore eucalyptus and a few stubborn peonies who had waited for us. Guests turned, and I felt the room shift, the way crowds do when they're rooting for the protagonist to make it to the kiss. Pastor Hale, Klein's vacation replacement, but just as steady, welcomed everyone and then surprised me. "Before vows," she said, "the couple would like to share a word." She looked at me. Claire must have bribed her with cookies. "I took the mic 2 days ago," I said. A sentence arrived that could have changed everything. "We waited for the truth, and the truth was kind. We want to thank you for giving us space to let facts do their work. If our aisle looks steadier today, it's because you held still with us. And if you're tempted to fill silence with rumor in the future, fill it with soup instead. It does more good." Laughter threaded the rows. The room relaxed into something like joy. We spoke our vows, simple and local, about ferry schedules and borrowed sugar and fixing bikes and calling each other in when all we want to do is call out. When the pastor said, "You may kiss," we did, and it felt less like spectacle and more like punctuation. At the reception, the toasts behaved. Dennis kept his under 2 minutes. Carol cried happy tears that left no streaks. Mom's toast was the only one that drew a hush. "May your home be a place where truth is told early and kindness late," she said, "and may your children never have to learn hard things on a schedule." Then, unexpectedly, she turned to Dad. "Robert." He stood, awkward as a teen. "Thank you for telling the truth. Late is worse than early, but better than never. Goodbye." She set her glass down. There it was, the softest, firmest ending. Dad nodded. Not a bow, not a plea. A nod. A man accepting a door that had closed without slamming. We danced to a song that sounded like porch lights. The band played louder when the crying started and softer when it threatened to turn into spectacle. Elaine pulled me into a hug on the edge of the dance floor and said, "You're my daughter today, and Mom," passing with a plate of cake, called back, "Mine first," and we agreed on shared custody of joy. When the night thinned, Nick and I stood under the string lights and watched the ferry cut a bright line across the dark water. "You still want the word neighbor in our vows?" he asked. "Always," I said. "Neighbors know where the spare key is." "Kids," he said softly, not as a pressure but as a question hung on a star. "Someday," I said. "Maybe not from my body, maybe from the world." Years moved the way years do, slowly until suddenly. We sent postcards from a honeymoon we could afford, Cannon Beach, and the kind of rain that makes everything greener. On a January morning 2 winters later, we signed paperwork in a county office whose decor had surrendered decades ago, and a social worker placed a sleeping baby in our arms. Her name was Maya because it felt like a bridge between languages. She smelled like milk and the future. The clerk stamped something official, and I thought of the DNA letter on the mantel that had once decided our direction and smiled at the symmetry. Papers closing doors, papers opening them. Dad came by a week after we got home, stood on the porch with a stuffed giraffe and clean eyes. "I'm in a program," he said simply. "Not the kind you clap for, the kind you do." He didn't ask to hold Maya. He asked how to change a light bulb in our finicky hallway fixture because love, for some people, arrives in 60 watts. He fixed it and left without staying for dinner. Boundaries can be acts of affection too. On the first spring evening that smelled like garden centers and wet soil, we took Maya to the lodge where we'd married and let her clutch a peony leaf between fingers that were learning how to be fists. The manager waved from the doorway. "You too," she called. "You kept the aisle." We laughed, and it landed like a benediction. Sometimes I still wake before the ferries and listen to the house breathe. The lists on our fridge now say things like diapers, oatmeal, call the plumber, not hold or cancel. But I keep one old list in a drawer. Tell the truth early / leave the secrets at the curb / love the people who show up with soup. When I teach hard talk workshops at the community center now, I tell the teenagers that bravery is rarely loud. It's an envelope in a clinic. It's a microphone used once, well, It's a mother setting down a glass and a father nodding to a closed door. It's a couple choosing neighborliness as a practice, not a past. And it's a little girl sleeping on my chest while the ferry's horn rolls across the bay and my husband whispers, "We kept the aisle," like a prayer answered by ordinary days.